Hunter's Lodge, a tale of murder and mystery. It's funny how life has a way of pulling you into its most bizarre and chilling games when you least expect it. For Hercule Poirot, even influenza wasn't enough to keep him away from the scent of a mystery, or at least, not entirely. What began as a quiet convalescence for the famous detective soon spiraled into a web of suspense, lies, and murder. And at the center of it all? A small, desolate shooting lodge in the heart of the Derbyshire moors, shrouded by fog and secrets that refused to stay buried. As the clock struck noon, Poirot sat up in bed, surrounded by a fortress of pillows, his impeccable mustache twitching ever so slightly. Even in illness, the great detective maintained his air of precision and poise. "After all," he murmured in his thick Belgian accent, "it is possible that I shall not die this time." His attempt at humor, coming from someone battling influenza, earned him a chuckle from his faithful companion, Captain Hastings. "That's the spirit, Poirot," Hastings replied, sensing a flicker of his friend's usual brilliance returning. The quiet recovery was soon interrupted by a knock at the door, followed by the landlady's hurried voice. "There's a gentleman downstairs," she announced, her tone tinged with urgency. "He insists on seeing Monsieur Poirot, or you, Captain Hastings. Says it's an emergency." When Hastings descended, he was greeted by a man of sharp appearance yet haunted eyes. Roger Havering, a name that would soon be etched in his memory. With an air of desperation, Havering declared, "It's imperative that Monsieur Poirot comes with me to Derbyshire. My uncle, he was murdered last night." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, their weight undeniable. Murder. The kind of word that sends chills down your spine, that promises a story dripping with suspense and danger. Hastings raced back upstairs, relaying the grave news to Poirot. The detective, though weakened, recognized the opportunity. "Go, Hastings. You know my methods by now. Follow my instructions, report back daily, and together we will uncover the truth." An hour later, Hastings found himself seated opposite Havering on a train bound for the windswept moors of Derbyshire. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels seemed to echo the questions swirling in his mind. Who was this Uncle Harrington Pace? And why would someone want him dead? What awaited them at the isolated Hunter's Lodge, and what secrets would they unearth? Havering, his voice strained yet resolute, began to fill in the gaps. Hunter's Lodge is a small shooting box, simple but adequate for a weekend retreat. My uncle has been living with us for the past 3 years, ever since family tensions drove him away from his brother and my elder sibling. A wealthy man, he took a liking to me, perhaps seeing in me the prodigal son he once was. He paused, his gaze distant. "Yesterday, we all traveled to the lodge for a brief respite. I returned to London for urgent matters, leaving my wife and uncle behind. This morning, I received a telegram from my wife. It was brief, chilling. 'Come at once. Uncle Harrington murdered last night.'" Hastings studied the man carefully. There was something about his tone, a mixture of shock, sorrow, and something more elusive, as if he was holding back. The detective in him itched to ask more, but he held back. There would be time. As the train raced through the English countryside, a foreboding sense of unease settled over Hastings. The murder of Harrington Pace was just the beginning. What lay ahead was a mystery that would test his wits, his courage, and his ability to step into Poirot's formidable shoes. Little did I know, Hastings would later reflect, that Hunter's Lodge was a place where secrets roamed freely, and every shadow held a story waiting to be told. And on that cold, gray morning, I was hurtling straight into the heart of it. It was nearing 3 o'clock when we arrived at the small, desolate station of Elmer's Dale. The cold, biting wind seemed to whisper secrets of the moors as we stepped off the train. A solitary carriage awaited us, its driver wrapped in layers to shield himself from the unrelenting chill. The landscape beyond was barren and rugged, an expanse of wild heather and jagged rocks stretching as far as the eye could see. The 5-mile drive was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of the carriage wheels against the gravel. As we approached, a small gray stone house emerged from the mist like a ghostly sentinel. It stood lonely and brooding, nestled in the heart of the moors, with an air that could only be described as foreboding. "A lonely place," I muttered, breaking the silence. Havering nodded, his gaze fixed on the house. "I'll sell it as soon as I can," he said grimly. "I could never live here again." We unlatched the iron gate, its rusty hinges protesting with a loud creak. The narrow path leading to the oak door felt heavier with every step, as if the house itself were burdened with a dark secret it could not bear to hold any longer. Just as my hand reached for the knocker, the door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped out. "Japp!" I exclaimed, startled but not entirely surprised. The Scotland Yard inspector grinned, his sharp eyes twinkling despite the grim circumstances. "Hastings, fancy seeing you here." He turned to Havering. "Mr. Havering, I presume?" "Scotland Yard sent me down this morning to oversee the case. I'll need a quick word with you, sir, before I head back to the village. Won't keep you long." "My wife?" Havering began, his voice tinged with concern. "I've spoken to her, sir, as well as the housekeeper. I've got all I need for now." Japp's tone was brisk but not unkind. "Hastings here can go on to the house. I'll catch up with you shortly." I nodded and made my way to the door. As I rang the bell, I felt an unsettling chill, not from the weather but from the weight of what lay within. The door opened after a few moments to reveal a middle-aged woman dressed in somber black. Her face was pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them before her. "Mr. Havering will be along shortly," I said, stepping inside. "I've come with him from London to assist with the case. Could you briefly tell me what happened here last night?" The woman hesitated, then closed the door behind me, leading me into a dimly lit hall. The faint scent of gun oil lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the moors. "It was after dinner, sir," she began, her voice low but steady. "A man arrived, asking to see Mr. Pace. He didn't give his name, which struck me as odd, but he spoke like an American, so I assumed he was a friend of Mr. Pace's from his time in the States. I showed him into the gun room and went to fetch Mr. Pace." She paused, her brow furrowing as she recalled the details. "Mr. Pace seemed puzzled when I told him, but he said to the mistress, 'Excuse me, Zoe, while I see what this fellow wants.' He went off to the gun room, and I returned to the kitchen. Not long after, I heard raised voices. It sounded like they were arguing. Then," her voice faltered, and she clasped her hands tighter. "Then I heard a shot." I leaned forward. "What did you do next?" "The mistress and I ran to the gun room, but the door was locked. We had to go around to the window. It was open, and inside—" She shuddered. "Inside was Mr. Pace, shot and bleeding on the floor. And the man. He must have fled through the window before we arrived," she said, shaking her head. "We saw no sign of him. Mrs. Havering sent me to fetch the police. It's a 5-mile walk to the station, but I didn't stop until I got there. The constable came back with me and stayed through the night. This morning, the inspector from London arrived." "What did the man look like?" I asked. She frowned, as if struggling to remember. "He had a black beard and was wearing a light overcoat. He was about middle-aged, I'd say, and spoke with an American accent." "That's all I noticed, sir." I nodded, absorbing her account. "Can I speak with Mrs. Havering?" "She's upstairs, sir. I'll let her know you're here." As the housekeeper disappeared up the staircase, I took in my surroundings. The house felt oppressive, its gray stone wall seeming to close in around me. The dim light from the small windows did little to dispel the gloom, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards above. Moments later, I heard a light, hurried step descending the stairs. I turned to see a strikingly beautiful young woman approaching me. Her flame-colored jumper clung to her slender, almost boyish figure, and her dark eyes sparkled with a mixture of determination and despair. "Mrs. Havering, I presume?" I said, stepping forward. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've come with my husband, she. The first thing that struck me about Mrs. Havering was her vitality. Even amidst the shadow of tragedy, she carried herself with a composure and energy that seemed almost unnatural in such grim circumstances. Her flame-colored jumper and matching leather hat framed her dark, expressive eyes, which sparkled with a mix of curiosity and defiance. When I introduced myself, her lips curved into a faint smile, and she nodded quickly. "Of course, I've heard of you and Monsieur Poirot," she said. "You've done some remarkable work together, haven't you? It was very clever of my husband to bring you here so promptly. Now," she added with an air of brisk efficiency, "how do we begin? I assume you'll have questions, and that's the easiest way to get to the heart of this dreadful matter, isn't it?" Her confidence and clarity were striking, and I wasted no time. "Thank you, Mrs. Havering. Let's start with last night. At what time did this man arrive?" She tilted her head, her brow furrowed slightly as she recalled the details. "It must have been just before 9 o'clock. We had finished dinner and were sitting over our coffee and cigarettes. My husband had already left for London by then. He caught the 6:15 train. How did he get to the station? Was it by car? Our own car isn't here. One came out from the garage in Elmersdale to take him in time for the train." I nodded, noting this detail. "And your uncle, was he acting normally before the visitor arrived?" She gave me a puzzled look. "Absolutely. He was his usual self, calm, composed, and perfectly normal." "And this visitor? Did you see him?" Mrs. Havering shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. Mrs. Middleton, our housekeeper, showed him directly into the gun room and then informed my uncle. I only heard about him when my uncle excused himself, saying, 'Excuse me, Zoe, while I see what this fellow wants.' He seemed slightly annoyed, but went to meet him immediately. And then?" She drew a sharp breath, her hands clenching the armrest of her chair. "It was only about 5 minutes later that I heard raised voices. They were arguing, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I rushed out into the hall and almost collided with Mrs. Middleton. Then, suddenly, there was a gunshot." Her voice faltered, but she regained her composure quickly. "The gunroom door was locked from the inside, so we had to go around the house to the window. That took some time, and by then the murderer had escaped." She paused, her eyes darkening. "My poor uncle. He had been shot through the head. I saw immediately that he was dead. I didn't touch anything and sent Mrs. Middleton to fetch the police." Her meticulous account impressed me, but I wasn't done yet. "The weapon, can you tell me anything about it?" She nodded. "A pair of revolvers belonging to my husband were mounted on the wall in the gun room. One of them is missing. I pointed this out to the police, and they've taken the other one for examination. I assume they'll match the bullet to confirm it's the same type." "May I see the gun room?" "Of course," she replied. "The police have already finished their work there, but the body has been removed." She rose gracefully and led me to the scene of the crime. As we entered the room, Havering returned to the hall. Mrs. Havering excused herself and rushed to meet him, leaving me alone to examine the scene. The gun room was a simple masculine space, dominated by dark wooden furniture and hunting trophies. A faint metallic smell of blood lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of gunpowder. The most notable feature was a large, dark stain on the carpet, marking where Harrington Pace had fallen. I examined the room with painstaking care, but to my disappointment there were no obvious clues, no scraps of paper, no misplaced objects, nothing to give me an immediate lead. I snapped a few photographs with my small camera, determined to document every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. The window, through which the murderer had presumably fled, was slightly ajar. The ground outside was heavily trampled, making it impossible to discern any clear footprints. Frustrated but not deterred, I resolved to continue my investigation elsewhere. Leaving Hunter's Lodge behind, I made my way back to Elmer's Dale and met Japp at the Matlock Arms. The Scotland Yard inspector was as brisk and unflappable as ever, but his expression grew grim as he led me to view the body. Harrington Pace was a small, spare man, clean-shaven, with sharp features that were unmistakably American. He had been shot through the back of the head at close range. "Turned away for a moment," Japp remarked, "and the other fellow snatched up a revolver and shot him. The revolver Mrs. Havering handed over was fully loaded, so I'd wager the missing one was as well. Blasted foolishness, keeping loaded guns hanging on the wall like ornaments." "What's your impression of the case so far?" I asked as Inspector Japp leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and certainty. "You know," he began, "for a moment there, I really had my eye on Mr. Havering. It's always the money, isn't it? The uncle's will, well, you can bet your boots that it'd be in his favor. And considering Havering's debts, this would be a pretty convenient way to solve them." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Japp's line of thought. "So, why didn't you pursue him further?" Japp chuckled. "Oh, I wanted to catch him before he saw his wife, but it turns out their statements match up perfectly. And here's the clincher. Havering's alibi checks out. I've been to the station, no doubt about it. He left on the 6:15 train and got to London by 10:30. Went straight to his club. If that's confirmed, and it seems it will be, then there's no way he could have been back here at 9 o'clock, wearing a black beard, shooting his uncle in cold blood. The image of Havering in a false beard struck me as absurd, but I couldn't help asking, "And what do you think of that beard, Japp?" A mischievous grin spread across Japp's face. "Ah, the beard," he said with a wink. "Funny thing that, it must have grown mighty fast, right in the 5 miles between Elmer's Dale and Hunter's Lodge. Americans I've met are usually clean-shaven, you know. Suspicious, if you ask me." Japp paused, his tone turning more serious. "I questioned the housekeeper first, then Mrs. Havering. Their stories line up well enough. Still, it's a shame Mrs. Havering didn't see the man herself. She's a sharp one, that lady. Could have noticed something useful, something to put us on the right track." I nodded, but my mind was already racing. The details weren't adding up. The mysterious black-bearded man, the locked door, the missing revolver, and the meticulous Mrs. Havering. It all felt too neat, too perfect. That evening, I sat down to compose a detailed account for Poirot. It was my usual style, meticulous, methodical, and thorough. I included everything Japp had shared, along with a few developments that had surfaced since our last conversation. The first breakthrough came when the bullet was extracted from Harrington Pace's body. It matched the caliber of the revolver Mrs. Havering had handed to the police, identical in every way to the one missing from the gun room. That alone was no surprise. But the second development was far more intriguing. Havering's alibi, scrutinized from every angle, was airtight. He had indeed arrived in London on the 6:15 train. Multiple witnesses, including the station staff and members of his club, confirmed his presence in the city well before the murder took place. That put him miles away from Hunter's Lodge at the time of the crime. And then there was the most sensational twist of all. Early that morning, a city gentleman on his way to the district railway station in Ealing stumbled upon a curious sight: a brown paper parcel wedged between the railings of Haven Green. Intrigued, he opened it, only to find a revolver inside. The discovery caused an immediate stir, and by nightfall it was confirmed. This was the very revolver we had been searching for. The missing gun from Hunter's Lodge. Only one bullet had been fired from it, completing the picture of the crime. I added all of this to my report, feeling a flicker of triumph. Surely Poirot would be impressed with the thoroughness of my work, but Poirot, as ever, was a step ahead. The following morning, as I sat enjoying a modest breakfast, a telegram arrived. It was brief, pointed, and, typical of my little friend, tinged with exasperation. Of course, black-bearded man was not Havering. Only you or Japp would have such an idea. Wire me description of housekeeper and what clothes she wore this morning. Same of Mrs. Havering. Do not waste time taking photographs of interiors. They are underexposed and not in the least artistic. I couldn't help but scowl at his unnecessary sarcasm. Underexposed and not artistic? Really? Poirot's tone may have been facetious, but his instincts were always sharp. The request for descriptions of the housekeeper and Mrs. Havering was odd, to say the least. Why focus on them when the revolver and Havering's alibi seemed to be the pivotal points? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot was onto something. There was a thread here, a thin, almost invisible thread, that he had spotted, while I was still fumbling through the fabric of the case. The black-bearded man might not have been Havering, but who was he? And why had no one seen him clearly? Something about this case was off, and as I prepared to wire the descriptions Poirot had requested, I realized the full scope of the puzzle was still hidden in the shadows. The game was far from over. I'll admit it. Poirot's telegram left me dumbfounded. His suggestion that I describe the clothing worn by the two women struck me as not just peculiar, but outright absurd. What possible relevance could such trivial details hold in a case so deeply tangled in murder? Yet Poirot was Poirot, and I had long learned not to underestimate his methods, no matter how eccentric they seemed. Grudgingly, I did my best to comply, though I, a mere man, could hardly be expected to describe women's attire with any degree of accuracy. To my eyes, clothes were just clothes. Nevertheless, I jotted down everything I could recall. Mrs. Havering's flame-colored jumper, the housekeeper's plain black dress. It felt like a futile exercise, but I knew better than to question Poirot's eccentricities. At 11, a reply wire arrived, terse yet electrifying in its implications. Advise Japp arrest housekeeper before it is too late. I stared at the telegram, rereading it twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Arrest the housekeeper? Mrs. Middleton, the quiet, unassuming woman who had blended so seamlessly into the background of this grim affair. The very idea seemed preposterous. Still, Poirot's instincts were rarely wrong, and I immediately took the wire to Japp. The inspector's reaction was as sharp as I'd expected. "He's the goods, that Monsieur Poirot," Japp muttered, swearing softly under his breath. "If he says so, there's something in it, and I hardly notice the woman. Just goes to show, eh?" Still, he hesitated, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I don't know if I can go so far as to arrest her, but I'll have her watched. Let's head up and take another look at her." Unfortunately, Poirot's timing, as brilliant as it often was, had been just a fraction too late. By the time we reached Hunter's Lodge, Mrs. Middleton was gone, vanished into thin air like a wisp of smoke on the moors. Her belongings left behind in her room offered no clues. A box of ordinary clothes, utterly mundane in every way, provided no insight into her identity or whereabouts. It was as if the woman had never existed. The disappearance threw an entirely new shadow over the case, and we turned to Mrs. Havering for answers. Her account, though straightforward, only deepened the mystery. "I engaged her about 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Havering explained, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Mrs. Emery, our previous housekeeper, had left, and I contacted Selburn's agency in Mount Street. It's a very well-known agency. I've always found my staff through them. They sent several women for me to interview, but Mrs. Middleton seemed the most suitable. She was polite, quiet, and had excellent references. I hired her on the spot and notified the agency immediately." She paused, shaking her head. "I can't believe there was anything suspicious about her. She was such a nice, respectable woman." "Yet she bolted," Japp said dryly. "Respectable women don't vanish into the night unless they've got something to hide." The implications were chilling. While Mrs. Middleton couldn't have physically committed the crime, both Mrs. Havering and the housekeeper had been in the hall when the shot was fired. Her abrupt flight suggested a connection to the murder. But what could that connection be? I wired the latest developments to Poirot, including Mrs. Middleton's disappearance and Mrs. Havering's account. My own instincts told me to return to London and investigate Selburn's agency. Surely they could shed light on the mysterious housekeeper's identity. Poirot's response came swiftly, and as always it left me feeling both impressed and confounded. Useless to inquire at agency. They will never have heard of her. Find out what vehicle took her up to Hunter's Lodge when she first arrived there. The cryptic message raised more questions than it answered, but I knew better than to argue. Poirot's requests always led somewhere, even if I couldn't see the path. Elmer's Dale wasn't exactly bustling with transportation options. The local garage had only 2 cars, and there were 2 station flies available. Yet none of these had been requisitioned on the date Mrs. Middleton first arrived. Determined to leave no stone unturned, I took it upon myself to make inquiries at Selburn's agency in London. The result? Exactly as Poirot had predicted. The agency had no record of a Mrs. Middleton ever being on their books. They had indeed sent several candidates to Mrs. Havering, but none matched the housekeeper's description. When Mrs. Havering sent her engagement fee to the agency, she had neglected to mention which candidate she had selected. The agency, believing the matter settled, had not pursued further details. The facts were damning. Mrs. Middleton hadn't been hired through Selburn's agency at all. Her references were likely fabricated, her identity a carefully constructed lie. She had insinuated herself into Hunter's Lodge with a precision and subtlety that spoke of careful planning. And then, when the murder occurred, she had vanished just as smoothly. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still obscured. Who was Mrs. Middleton? How had she known to insert herself into the Haverings' lives at just the right moment? And most importantly, what was she hiding? As I pondered these questions, I couldn't help but feel a grudging admiration for Poirot. Even from a distance, his sharp mind was peeling back the layers of this case with a surgical precision. And though I didn't yet understand where this trail would lead, I knew one thing for certain. Mrs. Middleton was the key. Hunter's Lodge, with its desolate moors and dark secrets, was far from finished with us. When I returned to London, I found Poirot comfortably ensconced in his armchair by the fire, a steaming cup of chocolate in hand. The sight of him, so serene and composed, was a stark contrast to my own frustrated state. "Mon ami Hastings," he exclaimed, his eyes lighting up as he saw me. "How glad I am to see you. Truly, I have a great affection for you, you know. Tell me, did you enjoy yourself? Running to and fro with the good Japp, Asking questions, investigating, unraveling mysteries to your heart's content? Poirot, I groaned, dropping into the chair opposite him. The whole thing is an impenetrable fog, a dark mystery. It will never be solved. Poirot chuckled softly, his mustache twitching with amusement. Ah, my dear Hastings, it is true, we may not cover ourselves with glory this time. But do not despair. After all, cracking a nut is no challenge for me. I am a veritable squirrel. I stared at him, bewildered. Poirot, this is no time for jokes. This case is impossible. A hard nut, as you say, but one beyond even your cracking. Non, non, mon ami, Poirot replied, his tone suddenly serious. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes gleaming. It is not the cracking of the nut that embarrasses me. I already know who killed Mr. Harrington Pace. You what? I cried, sitting bolt upright. How did you figure it out? Poirot waved a hand dismissively. Your answers to my telegram supplied me with all I needed to know. Let us now, my dear Hastings, examine the facts methodically and in order, as is the way of Hercule Poirot. He began ticking off points on his fingers. First, Mr. Harrington Pace was a man of considerable fortune, which, at his death, would pass to his nephew. That is point 1. Second, this nephew, Roger Havering, is a man desperately in need of money. That is point 2. Third, this same nephew has a reputation, how shall we put it, of loose moral fiber. That is point 3. I interrupted, shaking my head. But Roger Havering was proven to be in London when the murder occurred. Précisément, Poirot agreed. He could not have been the one to shoot his uncle. The timings make it impossible. And yet, Hastings, we forget something important. There is also a Mrs. Havering in this story. But she was with the housekeeper at the time of the murder, I protested. Ah, yes, Poirot said, his voice softening. The housekeeper, or rather, the housekeeper who disappeared. Tell me, Hastings, do you not find her peculiar? A woman so quiet, so respectable, and yet she vanishes as if the earth had swallowed her whole. I frowned. She was playing her part, I suppose. Maybe she admitted her confederate, the black-bearded man? Poirot shook his head with a sly smile. No, mon ami. Her part was far more ingenious. Her role was to provide an alibi for Mrs. Havering. And that, my friend, is why no one will ever find her, because she does not exist. I gaped at him, stunned. What? No such person? What do you mean? Poirot's voice grew animated, his hands gesturing as he explained. Zoe Havering, my dear Hastings, was an actress before her marriage. A talented one, I might add. Think, Hastings. You and Japp saw the housekeeper only in a dimly lit hall, a middle-aged figure dressed in black, speaking in a faint, subdued voice. But tell me this. Did you ever see Mrs. Middleton and Mrs. Havering together at the same time? I opened my mouth to reply, but closed it again. The truth was clear. No, we had not. Poirot continued, his voice triumphant. It was child's play for a clever and daring woman like Zoe Havering. On the pretext of summoning her mistress, she would slip upstairs, exchange her black dress for a bright jumper and a hat with black curls attached, remove her makeup with a few deft touches, apply a hint of rouge. And voila. The subdued housekeeper transforms into the brilliant, vivacious Zoe Havering. But the revolver, I exclaimed. The one found at Ealing. It couldn't have been Mrs. Havering who placed it there. No, Poirot agreed. That was Roger Havering's task, and it was their one mistake. A man who commits murder with a revolver found on the spot does not carry it all the way to London. No, Hastings, their plan was simple. To divert the attention of the police, to shift the focus far from Hunter's Lodge. Roger Havering discharged one shot from the revolver, carried it to Ealing, placed it in the parcel, and returned to his club to reinforce his alibi. Meanwhile, Zoe Havering quietly shot her uncle after dinner, reloaded the revolver, replaced it on the wall, and began her charade as the grieving niece. I sat back, stunned. "It's incredible," I murmured, "almost unbelievable, and yet it is true," Poirot said with a nod. "But alas, mon ami, to bring them to justice will not be easy. Japp may try, but I fear we must leave them to fate, or, as you say, le bon Dieu." He sighed, his expression softening. "The wicked flourish, yes, Hastings, but always at a price." Poirot's words proved prophetic. Though Japp was convinced of the truth, he could not gather sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. Harrington Pace's fortune passed into the hands of his murderers. But justice, as Poirot had promised, was not done with them. Months later, I read in the papers that the Honorable Roger Havering and Mrs. Zoe Havering were among those killed in the tragic crash of the air mail to Paris. The news was brief, but to me, it carried a profound weight. Justice, in its own relentless way, had been satisfied.